bond between enemies. A German officer and an American medic shared a foxhole and a secret pact in 1944, and I am the only person left on this earth who knows which one of them actually pulled the trigger when the frost finally turned the ground to iron. I keep that secret in a locked toolbox in my garage, underneath a stack of old socket wrenches and a rusted pair of needle-nose pliers that I haven't used since the Eisenhower administration. My grandfather Arthur gave me that box on a humid Tuesday in July 1978, 3 days before he died in his sleep, and he didn't talk about the war until that night. He was a man who smelled like tobacco and sawdust, the kind of guy who could fix a transmission with a bobby pin and a prayer. He sat on his back porch in Ohio, watching the fireflies dance over the tall grass, and he looked at me with eyes that seemed to be focused on a place 5,000 miles away. He told me that life is just a series of small, hard decisions, and he said that most people are lucky enough never to face the one that forces you to choose between your soul and your survival. He wasn't a soldier who bragged. He didn't have pictures of himself in uniform on the mantle. He was a guy who worked at the plant, coached my little league team, and cried during the national anthem like clockwork. I was 18 then, worried about girls and the beat-up Ford I was trying to rebuild, and I didn't understand why his voice shook when he said that he was just a kid from a farm who had to learn how to bury his own mercy. Before the war, my grandfather was nobody special. He was a boy from a town so small the water tower was the only thing that could be seen from the interstate. He liked peach pie, he played the harmonica with a shaky vibrato, and he spent his Sunday afternoons lying on the hood of his truck staring up at the clouds. He was the kind of American who believed that the map ended at the county line and that life was meant to be lived in the sun. He didn't enlist because he hated anyone. He enlisted because the post office in town had a draft notice that smelled like wet paper and finality, and he decided that if he was going to go, he wanted to be the guy who tried to keep his friends breathing. He told me that when he got on that bus, he felt like he was watching someone else climb the steps, a shadow of the boy who had just finished shucking corn. He was a medic. He carried a bag that felt like it weighed as much as a small horse, stuffed with gauze that would never be enough and morphine syrettes that always seemed to disappear when you needed them most. He wasn't a hero in the way the papers wrote about back home. He was a guy who knew how to tie a tourniquet with one hand while the ground around him was turning into a crater. He was the guy who held the hands of boys who were calling for mothers they weren't going to see again, and he was the guy who had to learn to walk away while they were still whispering. I remember sitting in that dim garage with him, listening to the rain tap against the tin roof, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about the prom or my own plans for college. I was looking at his hands, rough, calloused, trembling just a fraction, and realizing that he had spent his entire life trying to scrub something off them that simply wouldn't come out. He told me that the winter of 1944 was a different kind of cold, a cold that didn't just bite your skin, but reached inside and turned your blood into slush. They were deep in a forest that he never named, somewhere where the trees were so dense that the light couldn't find the floor, and the snow was a gray, trampled carpet of misery. He was lost. He had gotten separated from his unit during a German counteroffensive that had hit them like a freight train in the middle of the night. The chaos had been total, a swirling madness of tracer fire and screaming, and when the sun came up, the silence was worse than the noise had ever been. He was alone, crouched in a foxhole that hadn't been finished, his canteen frozen solid, his ears ringing with the ghost of artillery. He was shivering so hard his teeth were clicking together like a metronome. Then he saw him. The German officer had stumbled into the same clearing, his coat torn, his face smeared with ash and something darker, clutching his side as if he were trying to hold his life inside his tunic. They looked at each other for a long time, neither one moving. My grandfather reached for his sidearm, but his fingers were so numb they wouldn't close around the grip. The German reached for his own weapon, but his eyes were so hollow, so profoundly exhausted that he just let his hand drop into the snow. They were two men, two uniforms, two worlds, but in that hole they were just two bodies desperate for heat. My grandfather didn't shoot. The German didn't shoot. They sat there for 2 days, huddled back to back, the only thing keeping them from the frost being the heat radiating from each other's shivering frames. My grandfather told me he smelled the other man's tobacco, a sharp, clove-heavy scent that cut through the metallic reek of blood and mud. They didn't speak the same language, but they understood the same terror. Every time a plane droned overhead, they both pressed their faces into the dirt. Every time the wind howled, they leaned into each other, a pact formed in the shared, silent knowledge that if one of them moved, the other would die, and if they both stayed, they might just live until dawn. It was the dark humor of it that he remembered most. On the second night, the German produced a piece of hard, stale bread from his pocket and broke it in half, handing the bigger piece to my grandfather with a wry, toothy grin that didn't reach his tired eyes. My grandfather ate it, and he said it was the best thing he had ever tasted, even though it tasted like sawdust and frozen wool. He laughed when he told me that, a low, rasping sound that rattled in his chest, and he said that he and a man he was supposed to kill had sat there and shared a joke about the futility of it all, though neither of them knew what the other was saying. They understood each other through gestures, through the way they shared the meager protection of a wool blanket they'd pulled from a dead man's pack nearby. It was a strange, suffocating kind of love, the kind you only find when the world has gone entirely sideways and you are the only two people left in the galaxy. He looked at me then, his eyes watery in the dim light of the garage, and he said, "You have to understand, kid, that for those 48 hours he wasn't the enemy. He was my brother. He was the only person in the world who knew I was still breathing." But the war didn't care about their pact. It didn't care that they had shared bread or that they had kept each other warm in the middle of a frozen hellscape. The tension in that hole began to mount as the third day dawned, a pale, sickly light that filtered through the pines and made everything look like it was made of charcoal. They both knew that the quiet was ending. They heard the crunch of boots on the snow, not too far off, and they both knew that someone was coming. Maybe his people, maybe mine, it didn't matter. The secret was sitting right there in the open, the reality that they were going to have to decide who walked out and who stayed in that hole forever. My grandfather reached into his medkit and pulled out a bandage, trying to help the German with the wound in his side, his hands moving with a professional, practiced grace that hadn't left him even in the face of death. The German watched him, his expression unreadable, his hand hovering near the holster at his hip. My grandfather told me that he didn't fear the bullet as much as he feared the moment the choice would be made. He realized then that he had a responsibility to his own side, to the boys waiting back at the line, and that this bond, this strange, fragile piece of humanity, was a liability that could cost him everything. He looked at the forest around them, the trees standing like silent, indifferent sentinels of the carnage. He remembered the feeling of the earth beneath his knees, the way the frost crunched, the absolute, paralyzing weight of the decision he was about to make. He knew that if he turned his back to gather his gear, the German would have to decide if he was a soldier first or a man. And he knew that if he left the German there, he was leaving a part of himself behind in that hole. The air was getting thicker, the sounds of approaching patrols getting louder, the crunching of the snow vibrating through his boots. He felt the cold in his marrow, but it wasn't the weather anymore. It was the chilling realization of what it meant to survive. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff, his gear clattering against his sides, and he reached out a hand to help the German up, knowing that even as he did it, it might be the last thing he ever did. He felt the weight of his own rifle, the cold, hard steel of it against his shoulder, and the sheer impossibility of the situation settled over him like a shroud. The world was ending, and in that moment, in that frozen, God-forsaken pit, he felt more alive than he had ever felt in his life, and more terrified than he would ever be again. The shadows were lengthening, the sun dipping behind the ridge, and he looked at the German, who was struggling to find his footing, his face pale, his eyes searching. My grandfather said he looked into those eyes and saw his own life reflected back, the fear, the exhaustion, the hope that somehow this could end without another death. He held out his hand, and for a heartbeat, they were just two men, not soldiers, not enemies, just two souls trying to find their way home. Then the sound of a patrol, boots, voices, the distinctive, harsh clip of a rifle bolt being thrown, echoed through the clearing, coming fast, coming from both directions. He looked at the German, who had frozen, his hand still reaching for his belt, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp, and total understanding. My grandfather knew the patrol was on them. He knew he had 3 seconds before he had to decide if he was going to save his friend or save his life. He looked down at the bag on his shoulder, then back at the man who had shared his bread, and he felt the trigger of his rifle under his index finger, the metal biting into his skin. He took one breath, and it was the deepest, coldest breath of his entire life. The voices were shouting now, close, right on the other side of the ridge, and he turned to face the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The German stepped forward, his face a mask of resolve, and he said something in his language that sounded like a prayer or maybe a goodbye. My grandfather tightened his grip, the metal clicking softly, the world narrowing down to the space between their two chests. He felt the barrel of his rifle shift, the weight of it pulling at his shoulder, and he knew that in the next heartbeat, the silence of the forest would be broken, and the secret would be written in the snow. He looked at me, his eyes blurring, and he said, "I still hear that sound every time I close my eyes." The distant snap of a branch broke, the sound echoing through the clearing, and they both moved. I sat there in the dark garage, the smell of oil and old wood filling my lungs, watching him, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, waiting for the rest of it, waiting for the truth that he had kept for 34 years, the moment he finally decided to look me in the eye and tell me what really happened when the cold became the only law. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the eaves, and he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that sounded like dead leaves scuttling across a porch, the moment hanging in the air between us, a weight so heavy it felt like it would pull the house right off its foundation. He didn't blink. He just stared at the wall, and I knew that if I asked, he would answer, but I also knew that some things weren't meant to be heard by anyone who hadn't lived them. The silence stretched, a thin, taut wire pulling tighter and tighter, and just as I felt I might shatter from the tension, he looked down at his calloused hands again, flexed them, and started to tell me about the smoke. The smoke wasn't white like a campfire. It was a bruised, oily violet that curled up from the German's uniform the second the first shot tore through the stillness. It didn't come from my rifle. It didn't come from his. It came from the ridge, a sharp, mechanical chatter that signaled the end of our world. I saw the German jerk back, his eyes widening not with anger, but with a kind of profound, exhausted surprise, like he'd been waiting for a bus that finally arrived to take him somewhere he didn't really want to go. I didn't think. My body took over, performing a set of movements I had practiced in a field in Georgia until my muscles burned, but which I never, in my wildest, most fevered nightmares, thought I'd actually have to execute on a man I'd just shared bread with. I lunged for him, grabbing his shoulder, pulling him down into the depression of the Foxhole, my hands slipping on the wet, frozen fabric of his tunic. He felt heavy, not like a man, but like a sack of wet flour, his legs dragging behind him, his boots scraping against the iron-hard ground. I rolled him over, and the smell hit me then, not the clove tobacco anymore, but the hot, metallic, copper tang of blood hitting the cold air. It was a smell that sticks to the back of your throat, a taste that stays with you long after you've washed your face with snow. I worked on him, my hands moving with a mechanical, detached precision that scared me more than the incoming fire. I was a medic, that was the job, that was the oath, and for those few minutes, it didn't matter what color his collar was or what language he spoke in his prayers. I jammed the gauze into his side, my fingers sinking into the warmth of his body, the heat radiating against the sub-zero wind. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound that vibrated through my own chest, and he grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingernails digging into my skin, anchoring me to that hole. He was staring at the sky, his eyes reflecting the gray, bruised clouds moving rapidly over the canopy, and he kept trying to say something, his mouth working, but only a pink, frothy bubble formed between his lips. I kept talking to him, just rambling really, telling him about the truck I had back home in Ohio, the one with the primer gray hood and the radiator that leaked like a sieve. I told him about the summer heat, about the way the dust kicked up on the back roads, just to give him something, anything, other than the sound of the rounds kicking up the frozen mud around our rim. I needed him to stay. For some reason I couldn't articulate, because if he went, that pact, that tiny, fragile piece of humanity we'd forged, would be gone, and I'd be left in that forest as just another killer. The firing stopped as quickly as it started, leaving a ringing, high-pitched silence that felt heavier than the gunfire. My own platoon, or maybe just a wandering squad, had moved on, satisfied with the damage they'd done, leaving us behind in the deepening shadows. I looked at the German, and his grip had finally gone slack. His hand fell into the snow, palm up, fingers curled slightly like he was waiting for someone to drop a coin into it. He was gone. He looked peaceful almost, the tension leaving his face, the lines of exhaustion smoothing out, but his eyes were still open, staring at nothing or maybe everything. I sat there for a long time, the cold seeping through my trousers, turning my legs numb, the adrenaline fading into a dull, throbbing ache in my lower back. I checked my own kit, the familiar weight of the morphine syrettes, the sterile bandages, the heavy, dark reality of my duty. I was the only one left. I was the keeper of his last few minutes, the witness to the fact that he had been a man before he was a body. I stood up, my knees popping, the forest feeling unnervingly large, and I looked at his pockets. I knew the protocol. I knew I should take his papers, his identification, his sidearm, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like a violation. I left him there, the snow already beginning to fall, a fine, dusting powder that would cover him, hide him, turn him into just another part of the winter landscape. I walked for what felt like hours, not knowing where the lines were anymore, just following the terrain, the gray trees blending into each other, the path obscured by the thickening white curtain. I found my unit in a farmhouse that had been blasted into a jagged skeleton, the walls pocked with shrapnel, the roof sagged like a broken spine. The guys were huddled around a small, smoky fire built from floorboards, passing a tin cup of something bitter and warm. When I walked in, nobody cheered, nobody stood up. They just looked at me with hollow, mud-streaked faces, acknowledging my return with a tired nod. They were brothers, but they were ghosts too, their eyes fixed on the fire, their movements slow and deliberate. I sat down on a crate, the wood biting into my thighs, and I watched the flames, listening to the soft, rhythmic clicking of their gear. Someone offered me the cup. I took it, the metal burning my fingers, the taste of it, char, rain, and cheap coffee, bitter enough to make me shudder. I realized then that I hadn't said a word in 3 days, and when I finally tried to speak, my voice was just a dry, rasping croak that didn't sound like me at all. I was back, I was safe, but I was carrying that foxhole with me, buried deep under my ribs, a secret weight that I knew I would have to navigate for the rest of my life. The days that followed were a blur of movement and violence, of orders barked and hills taken, of lives snuffed out in seconds and meals eaten with trembling hands. I saw things that I don't talk about, things that don't belong in a human mind, but through it all, there was that moment in the woods, that singular, frozen event that served as the anchor for everything I did. We moved through villages that were nothing but piles of smoldering timber, the air thick with the smell of wet soot and decaying dreams. I remember a day, maybe a week after the clearing, when we were pinned down in a trench, the artillery raining down on us with a rhythmic, thunderous cadence that shook the world. A kid from Chicago, a guy named Miller who had a laugh that sounded like a flock of birds, was huddled next to me, clutching a letter from his girl. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a kind of desperate, vibrating energy, and he started reading the letter out loud to me, the words spilling out in a rush, plans for a wedding, the color of the flowers, the way he wanted to name their first son. It was surreal, the contrast between the mud, the whistling death overhead, and the delicate, fragile hope in his voice. I listened, my heart aching with a physical pain, knowing that he was trying to build a fortress of normalcy out of paper and ink. I laughed at his stupid jokes, the ones about how bad the chow was, and we leaned against each other, the weight of our gear pressing us into the frozen earth. That night, when the shelling finally tapered off into a desultory, sporadic thumping, Miller was gone, leaving only his helmet, half filled with slush, sitting on the edge of the trench. I didn't cry. I didn't have the room for it. I just picked up his helmet, wiped the slush out, and sat there, the silence ringing in my ears. The brotherhood was all we had, the only thing that kept us from dissolving into the chaos. We shared cigarettes, the embers glowing in the dark, and we talked about everything but the war. We talked about cars, about the best way to bait a hook, about the way a summer rainstorm hits the pavement back in the States. We were trying to keep the edges of our personalities from fraying, trying to hold on to the men we were before the machine took us. I remember one evening, the sky a bruised purple, and the air unusually still, when the sergeant, a man who had seen too much and said too little, sat down beside me and just stared at the horizon. He didn't look at me, but he reached out and patted my shoulder, a rough, callous touch that said everything. He knew he had to know that we were all carrying things that didn't have a name, ghosts that followed us from foxhole to foxhole. We didn't need to speak. The shared understanding was a palpable, heavy thing that hovered between us, a silent vow to keep moving, to keep breathing, to keep the machine from breaking us completely. The winter didn't break. It just deepened, the snow becoming a permanent, biting feature of our existence. We learned to survive in the cold, to find the small, hidden pockets of warmth, the temporary shelter of a basement or the hollow of a hill. The days blurred, the dates lost their meaning, and time became measured in meals and patrols. I remember one morning, the light cold and sharp as a razor, when we stumbled upon a small stream, the water running black and fast between banks of ice. I stopped to wash my face, the water so cold it felt like liquid needles, and I saw my reflection in a pool. I didn't recognize the man looking back. The eyes were older, the skin drawn tight over the cheekbones, a hollow, haunted look that I'd seen on the faces of the men who had been in the thick of it from the start. I looked at the reflection and realized that I was the only one who could see the truth. The world back home, the town with the water tower, the peach pie, the girl I'd taken to the dance, it felt like a dream from another life, a distant, golden memory that had no place here, in this frozen, violent wasteland. I stood up, wiped my face, and rejoined the squad, the weight of the secret, the weight of the war, settling back onto my shoulders like a comfortable, familiar coat. The mission, the one that broke the back of our resolve, came in the middle of a night so cold the air felt like crushed glass in the lungs. We were ordered to take a crossroads, a simple, tactical objective that was supposed to be undefended, a routine push. But it wasn't routine. It was a meat grinder. We moved through the darkness, the only sound the crunch of our boots and the low, muttered instructions of the squad leader. We crested the ridge and saw it, the crossroads, a cluster of buildings around a stone fountain, the water frozen in a jagged, translucent spike. And then the flares went up, turning the night into a blinding, sodium-bright day. The machine guns opened up from the tree line, a crossfire that shredded the air and made the ground dance with impact. I dove into a drainage ditch, the water icy and stagnant, and I felt the familiar, sickening lurch of terror in my gut. This wasn't a skirmish, this was an execution. Miller, not the one from Chicago, but a new kid, barely 20, with a face that still had the soft, round contours of adolescence, was right beside me, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a soundless scream. He was hit, a jagged, dark spray blooming across his chest, and he looked at me, his eyes searching, desperate, full of a raw, unadulterated fear that clawed at my throat. I crawled to him, the bullets kicking up sprays of mud and rock around my head, the world narrowing down to the 6 inches of space between us. I pulled out my kit, my fingers fumbling with the clips, the adrenaline screaming in my ears. I applied the pressure, my hands slick with his life, the warmth of it seeping through my gloves, but the wound was too deep, the damage too absolute. He whispered a name, a girl's name, or maybe his mother's. I couldn't tell, the sound lost in the thunder of the mortars. I held him, rocking him slightly, trying to offer some kind of comfort, some kind of presence in the middle of that hell, but he went limp, the light fading from his eyes with a terrifying, absolute finality. I was left there in the ditch with the body of a boy who had been laughing at a joke about a cow just 2 hours before, and the world around me continued to explode, the air filled with the screech of shrapnel and the acrid, biting scent of high explosives. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I just held him, my head pressed against his, the sound of the world ending all around us, and for the first time I felt the cold that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a cold that started in my marrow and radiated outward, a total, crushing numbness that settled into my soul. I don't remember how we got out of that ditch, how we made it back to the lines, or even who was left of the squad. The night was a sequence of fractured, violent images, the flash of an explosion that turned the trees into silhouettes, the scream of a man I recognized but couldn't name, the desperate, clawing scramble through the mud. I woke up the next morning in a truck, the engine vibrating through my spine, the canvas top flapping rhythmically in the wind. I was covered in dried mud, my uniform stiff, my hands still smelling of copper and wet earth. The other guys were there, but they were silent, their faces masked by layers of grime and exhaustion, their eyes staring into the middle distance. We weren't talking. There were no jokes, no stories, just the mechanical, rhythmic bump of the truck over the frozen road. I looked at the floor, at the stack of ammo crates, and I realized that we were all carrying the same thing, the weight of what we'd seen, the knowledge that we were different, broken, fundamentally changed in ways that no one back home would ever understand. I reached into my pocket and felt the small, smooth stone I'd picked up from that crossroads, the physical, tactile reality of that place, and I realized that I would never be able to leave it. It was part of me now, part of the architecture of my existence. We were pulled back to a rear echelon, a place of relative safety, but it felt wrong, the stillness, the lack of immediate threat, the artificial, forced normality of a camp that wasn't under fire. We were assigned to guard a supply depot, a mundane, boring task that felt like an insult to everything we'd been through. I spent my days standing at the gate, the rifle heavy in my hands, the smell of diesel and stale coffee the only thing that penetrated the boredom. At night, I couldn't sleep. The silence was too loud. I'd lie on my cot, staring at the canvas roof, and the images would come, the German in the Foxhole, the kid from Chicago, the boy at the crossroads, each one a precise, agonizing detail that played over and over, a looped film in the theater of my mind. I started drinking, the cheap, rot-gut whiskey doing little to dull the edge, just making the memories sharper, more vivid, more insistent. I was falling apart, and there was no one to catch me, no one who could understand, because even the guys in the squad, my brothers, my fellow survivors, were in their own separate, isolated prisons. We looked at each other, and we saw the same thing, a mirror image of our own despair, and we turned away, unable to bear the weight of it. I got a letter from home, the first one in months, the paper crinkled and smelling of home, of pine needles and laundry soap and the sharp, clean scent of rain on dry ground. My mother wrote about the town, about how the bakery had changed its sign, about how the neighbor's kid had enlisted, and it felt like she was writing from another planet. I read the words, and they didn't mean anything. They were just ink on paper, distant and irrelevant, a language I no longer spoke. I folded the letter, tucked it back into the envelope, and felt a wave of guilt so profound it made me nauseous. I was betraying them, I was leaving them behind, I was becoming something that didn't belong in their world. I realized then that the return, the long-awaited, dreamed-of return, was going to be the hardest part. How do you go back to being a son, a neighbor, a friend, when you have been a witness to the things I'd seen? How do you sit at a table and share a meal, knowing that the person sitting across from you has never smelled the air after a phosphorus strike? It was a divide that I knew would never be crossed, a a chasm that had opened up in my soul and would remain there empty and silent for as long as I lived. I remember one night, sitting on the edge of the cot, the dim light of the lantern casting long, flickering shadows, and I just laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a dry, hollow, rattling sound that filled the small space, a laugh of pure, unadulterated madness. I laughed at the absurdity of it, at the idea that I had thought I could go over there, do my job, and come back the same. I laughed at the pact, the bread, the German, the kid in the ditch, the entire chaotic, senseless, devastating machine of it. And then I stopped, the silence flooding back in, the weight of the realization pressing down on me. I was alone. I was absolutely, fundamentally alone. I looked at my hands, the hands that had held a dying man's wrist, the hands that had signed the papers, the hands that had held the rifle, and I saw them for what they were, instruments of destruction and conduits of misery. I felt a sudden, sharp, and total desire to be gone, to disappear, to leave the war, the world, everything behind, but I was still here, still breathing, still carrying the weight. I stood up, went to the small, cracked mirror on the wall, and looked at myself. I didn't see the kid from Ohio anymore. I saw a stranger, a man who had seen the bottom of the world and had been forced to look back up, a man who was still standing, but only just. The rumors of the end began to filter through, whispers of surrender, of treaties, of a world trying to patch itself back together. We heard it in the mess hall, we read it in the discarded, backdated newspapers, but it didn't mean anything to us. The war wasn't ending, it was just moving inside us, taking up permanent residence. I walked through the camp, the mud churning under my boots, and I looked at the new arrivals, clean, unscarred, full of a naive, eager energy that made my teeth ache. I wanted to warn them, to grab them by the shoulders and shout the truth into their faces, but I knew it wouldn't matter. They had to learn it for themselves, just like I had, just like my grandfather had, the hard, brutal, irrevocable way. I watched them, their uniforms crisp, their faces unmarked, and I felt a strange, detached pity. They were walking into a machine that would grind them into something else, something I recognized all too well. I turned away, the wind whistling through the barracks, and I went back to my cot, the secret of the foxhole, the smell of the smoke, the sight of the crossroads, all of it rising to meet me, a tide that I knew I would never be able to hold back. I started to write, a journal, a series of notes on the back of requisition forms, trying to capture the fragments, the small, specific details that I was afraid I'd lose. I wrote about the way the light hit the trees, the smell of the coffee, the look in Miller's eyes, the way the German had smiled when he broke the bread. I wasn't writing for anyone else. I was writing for the man I used to be, the one I was trying to hold on to. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the ink ran dry, until the paper was filled with a jagged, frantic scrawl that captured the chaos of my thoughts. I knew it wasn't enough, that words were just paper shields against the artillery of the past, but it was all I had. I was trying to map the terrain of my own soul, to understand how I could have been both the boy from Ohio and the man in the trench, and it was a map that was constantly being rewritten, constantly being erased by the next, inevitable wave of memory. I hid the pages in the lining of my duffel bag, a secret archive of my own descent, and I knew that when I finally went home, I would have to make a choice, to burn it all and pretend, or to keep it and slowly, agonizingly, allow it to become the foundation of the man I was going to be. The order came to move out, a deployment to the front, one last push before the end. We loaded the trucks, the engine smoke mixing with the morning mist, the air heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. I sat in the back, my rifle between my knees, the pack digging into my shoulders, and I looked at the guys around me. We were all silent, our eyes fixed on the road ahead, each of us locked in our own private, internal struggle. We were on our way to the end, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a continuation, a relentless forward momentum that we couldn't stop even if we wanted to. We drove through the landscape, the trees passing by in a blur, the fields of frozen mud stretching out to the horizon, and I realized that I was looking at the landscape not as a soldier, but as a ghost. I had already been in that ground, I had already died in that foxhole, I had already been shattered at that crossroads, and yet here I was, still moving, still breathing, still participating in the theater of the absurd. The truck hit a bump, throwing us all forward, and for a second we were a tangle of limbs and gear, a chaotic, uncoordinated mess, and then we settled back, the truck continuing its steady, rhythmic rumble, and we remained, a squad of survivors, a brotherhood of the broken, moving toward a destination that we were already terrified of reaching. We reached the front as the sun was setting, the sky a jagged, blood-orange tear in the gray canopy. The line was a chaotic, disorganized mess of trenches, foxholes, and craters, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and the metallic tang of blood. We were told to dig in, to hold the line, to defend the position at all costs. It was a command that had no meaning. The line was fluid, The position was already compromised. The cost had already been paid 1,000 times over. I started digging, the shovel biting into the frozen ground, each strike jarring my arms, the vibration running through my teeth. I worked with a rhythmic, mindless intensity, the exertion the only thing that kept the memories at bay. I dug until my hands were raw, until my back was a knotted cord of agony, until the foxhole was deep enough to disappear in. I sat down, the earth rising around me, the walls of my own little sanctuary closing in, and I looked out at the wasteland in front of me. It was empty, a desolate, moon-like surface of craters and mud, the only movement the erratic, ghostly dance of smoke from a distant fire. I was here, I was ready, and I was waiting for the inevitable, for the moment the silence would break and the world would end again. I heard the sound first, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to rise from the very center of the earth. It wasn't artillery, it was too regular, too close. I leaned against the wall of the trench, my ears straining, the air vibrating with the pressure. Then the sound of movement, a shuffle, a scrape, the faint, metallic clatter of gear. They were coming. The lines were shifting, the front was moving, and we were right in the middle of it. I looked at the guy next to me, a kid named Thompson who had joined us only a week before, his face still clean, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. He was gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles were white, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I reached over and tapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of reassurance, a silent command to stay, to breathe, to hold. He looked at me, his eyes searching, and I saw my own reflection in them, the same hollow, haunted, dead look that I'd been trying so hard to hide. I turned back to the front, the sound growing louder, the pressure in the air reaching a breaking point, and I felt the familiar, cold, paralyzing weight of the decision settling over me. The world was ending again, and this time there would be no pact, no bread, no shared humanity. Just the cold, the mud, the rifle, and the final, absolute requirement to do what I had to do, to be who I had to be to survive. The first flare went up, a blinding, magnesium-white light that turned the night into a distorted, high-contrast nightmare. The ground in front of us came alive with shapes, shadows moving through the smoke, their silhouettes jagged and unnatural. The firing started, a sustained, thunderous wall of noise that swallowed the world, the air thick with the whine of bullets and the heavy, earth-shaking thud of mortar rounds. I didn't think. I didn't feel, I just moved, the rhythm of the training taking over, the rifle in my hands an extension of my own body, the target in my sights a fleeting, indistinct shape that I had to hit. The world became a series of snapshots, a face lit by the flare, a hand reaching for a weapon, the spray of earth when a bullet hit, the sharp, stinging smell of gunpowder. I was a machine, a programmed, reactive entity, and the horror of it, the absolute, undeniable, visceral horror of taking another life, was something I pushed down into the deepest, darkest corner of my being, where it wouldn't interfere with the job. I was there, I was fighting, I was doing it, and every time I pulled the trigger, I felt a part of myself peel away, a layer of my soul sloughing off and leaving me a little thinner, a little colder, a little closer to the machine I was becoming. It lasted an eternity, or maybe 10 seconds. The light faded, the firing tapered off, and we were left in the suffocating, ringing darkness of the aftermath. I was still here. The foxhole was still mine. I looked around, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I saw Thompson lying on the ground, his face pale in the faint, lingering light of the dying flares. I crawled to him, my hands moving on instinct, but I didn't need to check. He was gone. He had been taken by the very thing I was trying so hard to avoid. I sat there beside him, the silence of the battlefield settling over us like a shroud, and I realized that I was the only one left. The squad was gone, the line was broken. The front had moved on, and I was the lone, surviving witness to the end of the world. I felt the cold creeping in, not the winter, but a deeper, more permanent freeze that started in my marrow and radiated outward, turning everything I touched, everything I felt, everything I was into stone. I looked at the sky, the stars indifferent, the moon a sliver of cold, hard light, and I knew that I would never be the same. I was the keeper of the secret, the bearer of the horror, the man who had seen the bottom of the world and had been forced to live. And as I sat there, the mud soaking into my clothes, the smell of blood filling the air, I started to shake, a long, slow, rhythmic tremor that I knew would never truly leave my body. I didn't move for hours. I just sat there, the weight of the war, the weight of the losses, the weight of the lives I'd taken and the lives I'd failed to save, all of it pressing down on me, a physical, crushing mass that made it hard to breathe. The world kept moving, the artillery continued to rumble in the distance, the wind continued to howl through the trees, but I was in a state of suspension, a static, frozen point in a moving, chaotic universe. I was the only one who knew what had happened, the only one who knew the exact, agonizing cost of that night, and it was a knowledge that felt heavy enough to sink the earth. I knew I had to move, I knew I had to get out, I knew I had to find a way back. But the idea of moving, of standing, of walking away from that hole felt like a betrayal. I was the guardian of that moment, the keeper of that memory, and to leave it behind felt like I was abandoning the very people who had been left there. I looked at Thompson, his face still in the pale light, and I felt a pang of sorrow so deep it was almost physical, a searing, sharp, and total grief that tore through the cold and left me raw, exposed, and vulnerable in a way I had never been before. I was still there, still in the middle of it, and every instinct in me was screaming to stop, to give up, to let the cold take me, but I couldn't. I had to keep moving, I had to keep breathing, I had to survive, not for myself, but for them, for the boys who hadn't made it, for the history that needed a witness, for the secret that needed a keeper. I stood up, the mud dragging at my boots, and I looked out at the wasteland one last time, the cold seeping into my very soul, and I started to walk, step by slow, agonizing step, into the darkness that stretched out before me. The transition back to being a civilian didn't happen on a specific day. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the person I'd been in the field until only the shell remained. We flew home on a gray, windowless cargo plane that rattled like a tin can in a hurricane, and I remember looking at the guys around me, all of us staring at the floorboards, nobody saying a word because we were all terrified that if we opened our mouths, we'd start screaming and never stop. When the plane finally touched down on American soil, I felt a physical shock, a disconnect so profound it made my knees buckle. We stepped out into the humid air of a tarmac in Georgia, and everything was too bright, too loud, and entirely too still. I watched a group of people waving from a chain-link fence, their faces lit up with a kind of joy I felt like I had no right to look at. I walked through the terminal in my service uniform, feeling like an alien in a land that didn't know it was supposed to be morning. I kept scanning the exits, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for the whistle of incoming fire that never came. My family picked me up at the airport, and the hug my mother gave me felt like a betrayal. She was crying, calling me her boy, but when I looked over her shoulder at the parking lot, all I saw was a series of tactical hazards. I didn't say anything, because what could I possibly tell them? That I had left my soul in a drainage ditch in a frozen hellscape 3,000 miles away. I sat in the passenger seat of our old sedan, the smell of pine sol and stale cigarette smoke making me nauseous. We drove through the suburbs, past the tidy lawns and the white picket fences, and it looked like a movie set designed to trick me into believing the world was still sane. That first night, I laid in my own bed, the sheets crisp and smelling of laundry detergent, and I didn't sleep at all. I spent the entire night on the floor under the bed frame, my hand gripping my service pistol, staring at the door. Every time a car drove by and the headlights swept across the ceiling, my entire body would lock up, my skin turning cold as ice. I realized then that I wasn't back. I was just a ghost haunting a life that didn't fit me anymore. The kitchen, usually the warmest room in the house, became a place I avoided. My father would try to talk to me about the news or the weather, his voice kind and oblivious, and I would just nod, my mind drifting back to the sound of that German's breathing. I felt an immense, suffocating guilt for being there, for sitting in a comfortable chair while the boys I'd left behind were still frozen in that dirt. I started going to the local VA, sitting in a beige, windowless room with a man who smelled like peppermint and looked at me like I was a broken clock he was trying to fix. I told him some of it, but never the hard parts, never the parts that still burned in my chest when the sun went down. He'd write notes on a legal pad and tell me it was normal to feel this way, but it didn't feel normal. It felt like I was carrying a corpse in my backpack, and I was the only one who could smell the rot. I stopped going after the third session because I couldn't bear the pity in his eyes. There were moments, though, that snuck up on me. I'd be walking down the grocery store aisle, looking at the rows of cereal, and the smell of floor wax would suddenly transport me back to the supply depot. I'd drop a box of cornflakes and stand there, frozen, my pulse racing, waiting for the shelling to start. People would stare, their faces etched with that specific civilian confusion, and I'd just turn and walk out, leaving the cart behind, my hands trembling. I stopped laughing around people. I'd be at a dinner, someone would tell a joke, and I'd start to chuckle, but then I'd catch myself, the memory of Miller's laugh echoing in my head, and I'd just stop. The sudden silence would sit at the table like a guest no one wanted, and I'd have to excuse myself, going out to the porch to breathe the night air until the tremor in my hands settled down. I felt like I was living a double life, one in the light, where I was the returning hero, and one in the dark, where I was still in the ditch, holding onto a life that had slipped away. I started taking long drives in the middle of the night, just to be somewhere where the silence was real. I'd go out to the old quarry near the county line, sit on the hood of my truck, and look at the stars. It was in those moments of absolute, crushing isolation that I found a strange kind of peace. Out there, away from the expectations, away from the well-meaning questions, I could be who I was, a man who had seen the bottom and survived, even if I wasn't entirely sure why. I started to understand that the damage wasn't something to be fixed, but something to be managed, a weight that I'd have to carry until the day I died. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about accepting that the war had taken a piece of me, and that the person who came home was someone else entirely. I found pride in that, too, a quiet, secret pride in the fact that I hadn't broken under the pressure, that I had held the line even when there was nothing left to hold. I was still standing, and in this world that was enough. Hope wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a slow, steady flicker. It happened the day I stopped checking under my car for wires before I started the ignition. It happened the afternoon I spent 4 hours in the backyard building a birdhouse, the smell of sawdust replacing the smell of smoke in my lungs. It was a small, quiet, and incredibly fragile thing, but it was there. I'm still here, and I still wake up at 2 in the morning sometimes, and I still listen to the silence of the house, but the fear doesn't paralyze me the way it used to. I've learned to live with the ghosts, to keep them in the corner of my mind where they can't touch the people I love. I still have the journal, the pages yellowed and brittle now, but I don't read them anymore. I don't need to. The memory is tattooed into my skin, into the way I walk, into the way I see the world. It's part of the architecture, the load-bearing wall that keeps the rest of me standing upright. Yesterday, I was in the kitchen, and my wife was humming a song while she made coffee. The sun was hitting the floorboards, making the dust motes dance in the light, and for a second, it felt like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I looked at her at the way her hair caught the light, and I realized that I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't in the foxhole, I wasn't at the crossroads, I wasn't holding a dying man's hand. I was just here in my house on a Tuesday morning, and I was alive. It was a simple, mundane, quiet moment, but it carried the weight of everything I'd survived to reach it. I walked over and touched her shoulder, and she turned and smiled at me, a smile that was full of a love that didn't know anything about the war, and I smiled back. I knew then that the healing wasn't about erasing the scars, it was about letting them be part of the story. I'm not the same man who left that town all those years ago, and I never will be again, but the man who sits here now is someone I can finally look at in the mirror without turning away. I don't tell this story to be heard, and I don't tell it to be understood. I tell it because the silence is a weight that eventually has to be lifted, even if just for a moment, so that you can keep breathing. I've accepted that I'm the keeper of the memory, the witness to the things that were too heavy to leave behind, and that's a role I have to play until the end. I still have hope, the kind that sits in the back of my throat like a cold stone, but it's real and it's mine, and it's enough to get me to the next sunrise. I look at the coffee cup in my hand, the ceramic still warm, and I feel a gratitude that is so quiet it almost hurts. It's not a big life, and it's not a loud life, but it's a life that I've earned, inch by painful inch, through the mud and the dark and the cold. I know now that the most important part of the story isn't the war, or the dying, or the horror of what we had to do. The most important part is the fact that I'm still standing here, choosing to pour another cup of coffee. The sunlight is moving across the table now, crawling toward the window, and I can hear the birds starting to wake up in the trees outside. It's a normal morning, a civilian morning, the kind of morning I dreamed of in the deepest, darkest parts of the winter, and I'm finally here to see it. I look at my hands, resting flat on the table, and they don't tremble anymore, not like they did in those first, jagged years. I take a sip of the coffee, letting the heat sink into my chest, a small, grounding comfort that reminds me I'm still connected to the earth. There is no moral, no final lesson, no grand summation of the human experience that makes the cost worth it. There is only this room, this chair, the smell of the morning, and the fact that I am breathing. I've carried this for a long time, held it close like a secret weapon, but today I'm just going to let it sit here in the quiet with me. I don't need to resolve it, and I don't need to fix it, because the truth is that we don't ever really come home. We just find a new way to live with where we've been. Everything is exactly where it is supposed to be.